And there we are, the doors are closed. You're all now locked in for the next little while. So thanks for coming. Again, thanks for coming. As you're getting settled, thanks. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the lands that we are sitting in today are unceded territory. And as with the rest of my RMIT colleagues, we generally, and I think it's really important, and I really like this tradition of acknowledging the traditional owners and the caregivers and caretakers of these lands, the Woiwurrung and the Boonwurrung language groups of the Kulin nations. We hope that in our work and in our research and in our approaches to conducting the business of the university and in conducting our own studies, that we can benefit from and be open to and learn from the perspectives and the ethical kind of grounding that comes along with these traditional owners of the land. So I would like to sort of have us put that in our minds for the next while, to try to embrace that the ancestors and elders, and whether they are past or present or emerging, are a big influence on what we think and how we think more than anything else. So I would like to acknowledge that, bring them into this room with them, and acknowledge those of you in the audience that come from the land. We represent the Digital Ethnography Research Center at RMIT, and I don't know how many of you know about this, but we are a research center that is in the that is across at least two colleges: the College of Business and Law and the College of Design and Social Contexts. If you want to learn more about us, we'll be here after the event to talk with you. And sitting in the panel today, you have me. My name is Annette Markham, and I'm a professor of media and communication. We have Professor Ingrid Richardson, who's also from media and communication. We have Professor Dan Harris, who's from, I'm sorry, Dr. Kelsey Nabin, who's from, she's getting ready to finish her PhD here. We've elevated your status here to doctor in anticipation that when this recording is finished, you will have been named doctor. We're certain of that for you. So Kelsey Nabin is part of the Blockchain Innovation Hub here at RMIT. And then Professor Dan Harris is also a member of DERC, as we affectionately call the Digital Ethnography Research Center, and she's from the School of Education. They are from the School of Education. My apologies. End of a long day, or just me not having my brain quite on. All right. It's because I was coming up to this slide, because this is a tricky slide. What is digital ethnography? And this is not an easy question to answer. And if you asked any one of the panelists here or the digital ethnographers in the audience, they would all give you a different answer. So you should keep in mind that this is particular to my perspective, although I'm trying here to be general about what is digital ethnography and what makes it distinctive. To me, when you have to take this question, you split it into two parts. The first part is what is ethnography, and the second part is what is digital. And then what makes digital ethnography in this day and age particular or distinctive. So if we take apart ethnography, many of you may already know this, but I'll just give some kind of core or basic definitions. And again, many ethnographers would not agree that this is quite the definition they would use. But ethnographers tend to focus on cultural phenomenon. Cultural meaning, what makes societies societies, what is important about people. But it is also a way of doing inquiry. So it is an epistemology that recognizes and emphasizes the insider perspective, which anthropologists call EMEC. Ethnography as a methodology generally privileges inductive, immersive methods. It has a strong tradition in qualitative practice, and it draws its strength historically from sociology and more traditionally, in a longer legacy, anthropology. Generally speaking, ethnography is about getting close to the phenomenon as it occurs in some sort of field, and then using a broad set or a variety of tools to collect, to analyze, and interpret. Ethnography also happens to be the name of the product of ethnographic inquiry, so ethnographies are also written accounts by ethnographers. That's enough to get us started. So let's move on to the digital. So this is also quite complicated. The Digital Ethnography Research Center here has been around for now 11 years. And then digital ethnography was relevant because the digital was not quite as commonplace as it is, not quite as embedded as it is now. But when we think about digital ethnography and the origins of digital ethnography, it's worth thinking about that the digital literally means analog versus digital forms of communication, interaction, and social formation. So if we think about what the digital is, you can use that as kind of a qualifier for what digital ethnography might be, but it isn't always very useful because it's so commonplace. We can also think about different kinds of digital formats or digital media, such as social media, mobile media and games, platforms, or algorithms, machine learning and AI. All of those are implicated in what we might call the digital. And honestly, the digital is a very broad concept that gets debated quite a lot. We could also think about, and many scholars who call themselves digital ethnographers think about networks, and they might not call it networks. That's my kind of umbrella term for thinking about things like the internet, blockchain, or other kinds of digital networked infrastructures that provide, facilitate, or control the flow of digital data, or the infrastructures or structural formations or social formations that emerge from those flows of digital media. You could also consider the digital to be the processes of digitalization or the processes of datafication, the processes through which information and communication are mediated by technologies, digital technologies. So the digital, because it becomes so embedded and embodied and ubiquitous, becomes a sort of a generic frame in a way. But it's important to note that for digital ethnographers, the digital is actually quite central. I would say that one of the things that makes digital ethnography distinctive is that well, in the most straightforward of ways, we can say that digital ethnographers might use digital media to augment traditional or typical ethnographic tools. So you might do interviews via chat, or you might do engagement with participants or survey design or understanding people's communication habits by looking at their communication practices in digital media or through digital media or on social media. So you can think about the ways that digital media augment ethnographic methods of engagement. You can also understand that digital ethnographers will look at digital culture. Specifically, they might be interested in digital culture, digital contexts, digital platforms, or digital transformations. So while some scholars might use digital tools to conduct ethnography, others are focused on digital culture as a focus of their ethnographic inquiry. And in a sense, digital ethnographers focus on what I think that a strength of digital ethnography is that calling it digital ethnography means we're focusing a little bit on a different way of asking questions. That is, we're interested in how the digital is implicated in our research practice or in the cultural phenomenon that we study. So the digital may not always be the central focus of one's study, but it is a central feature. So it's always under the surface of what it is that makes the phenomenon relevant or salient. So those are the things that I think will help inform the discussion to think about some of those characteristics that make digital ethnography distinctive, as it were. And you can ask questions about that later. I think it's something that we a lot of times take for granted. We call it digital ethnography, and we kind of use that as a broad umbrella to invite a lot of different kinds of inquiry practices within it. So you will see when you hear from each of the four of us as we talk about our own approaches and our own types of research, that the digital weaves in and out of our ethnographic practice in different ways. And you'll also see that we each define ethnography in very distinctive and particular and different ways. With that, I will then start the showcase. And we're going to begin with Ingrid, who's going to try to stand up for this. And do you want any time cards or anything? You're good to go. Okay. All right, we're going 15 minutes each, and this is forward. Okay. That's back. Okay. Super.
Cool. Thank you.
And you have to introduce yourself.
All right. Hi, everybody. So my name's Ingrid Richardson from the School of Media and Communication. I've been at RMIT since the beginning of 2020, which you can imagine what fun that was. Arriving at the very, I think I had a month of coming on campus before we went into lockdown. So that was a very interesting and lots of opportunities in particular for digital ethnographers, I think, during that time. I was going to start today by getting you to do a little activity, but I thought we'd be sitting at tables. It's probably, I'll get you to do it anyway if you have. I just want you to take your phone out. If you've got a seat next to you, put it on the chair next to you. If not, you can just hold it. So this is an activity, a kind of like I guess a bit, a bit of a sort of a haptic experiment. particularly if you've put it down next to you, it works better if you're sitting at a table. I basically asked people, so how many of you have got your phone face up at the moment with the screen showing? And how many face down? Cool, interesting. Okay, so this is an activity that we often get our participants to do, asking them about also the vibrate function. And when we question participants about why and how they handle their mobile phones and get them to do little kind of activities or experiments like that one, and talk a little bit about it, they reveal how, you know, a seemingly trivial gesture, just simply like taking your phone out and putting it on a table, really actually embodies a wealth of deep attitudes about privacy, about the boundaries between work and play. Often it'll depend on the context, what you do with your phone in particular context, if it's out, if you've got it in a bag or your pocket, etc. And also social etiquette. And also care for the device. So these are kind of all these new, most of my focus in my own research is on mobile media, haptic screens and games and play as well. And with a particular focus, I think, on the domestic context, sort of domestic neighbourhood context. And looking in particular at these kinds of techniques of the body that we've developed in relation to mobile media, or ways of interfacing with the materiality of the device. And these things are really important if we're to understand all the kinds of tacit assumptions we have that are embedded in everyday practices. So I'll just give you a very quick background. So my research takes a phenomenological perspective, and it's been many years, at least probably now 2 or 3 decades, that I've now learnt to say phenomenology without without stumbling, because it's quite a word, and also the other perspective, post-phenomenology as well, which I use. So basically, why use this perspective? It's a branch of philosophy that's kind of directly challenged Descartes' famous adage, I think, therefore I am, which basically positioned the mind and the intellect as that which grants us our awareness and defines, in a sense, the essence of what it means to be human. So in phenomenology, particularly through the work of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, knowing and being is grounded in sensory perception and the fact that we have the kinds of bodies that we do. So bodies that can see, hear, smell, taste and touch in synesthetic ways. You know, some theorists are now positing that we have over 20 senses, you know, including interoception and all kinds of different sorts of perceptions involving the insides of the body, the boundaries of the body, etc. So the fact that we have the kinds of bodies that we do and move about in the world move about in a world that has gravity and matter. Sensory perception is also, from a phenomenological perspective, always intertwined with objects in the world and with our environments, not least of which is comprised of our tools and technologies. Within the perspective, I think it's the interesting thing for me is that technologies and tools become aspects of our embodiment or parts of our corporeal schematics. We see, in Don Ide's terms, we see with technologies kind of in collaboration with them, or we perceive in collaboration with technologies, not through them, as if they're somehow transparent. Tactile or haptic activities such as typing, you know, touchscreen use or playing a mobile game, for example, upon repetition becomes like a knowledge in the hands. And I think that really the phenomenological perspective, when you're looking at something like mobile media, is about how such media change, transform, modify perceptual reach and the possibilities of communication. But our perceptions are also contextual and situated, or what I'd call multi-stable, in the sense that there's stability around collective habits. We all have lots of different collective habits that we all understand together about our mobile phone use, involving things like texting or emojis, etc. But that these also vary across culture and context. And it's understanding this variability that's important. We can only understand it in situ by observation, and we need to observe, you know, and elicit what's happening in order to understand this behaviour. And that's where ethnography comes in, and digital ethnography and haptic ethnography come in. I've just got some variability here. So, you know, when you're thinking about mobile phone use, there are many ways in which we are actually using mobile phones in unintentional ways and in kind of surprising ways. So this is a mobile phone case here. So lots of decoration and aesthetic around that. And Larissa Hjorth has actually done a really interesting study some time back on the kind of decorations that we put on our mobile phones and what that signifies. On the left, you've got an adaptation of a phone that includes pepper spray. So again, using mobile phones, and I'll be talking a bit about risk, the issues of safety and risk in the context of mobile phones. On the bottom left, this is a Michelin star restaurant in San Francisco that serves food on an iPad. As a way of making it more appetising. And in particular, there's also another restaurant that's been marketing food for children, the children's menu delivered on an iPad to get them to eat what's on the plate, so to speak. And then on the bottom right here, we've got some Twitter doofus cleaning his phone, apparently. So this is kind of like just a representation of the kinds of idiosyncratic behaviours that we can observe around mobile phones. Okay, so haptic ethnography, just giving a quick overview of the kinds of methods that are used. This is an article in New Media and Society, Larissa and I wrote a few years back. It was actually a special issue on haptic media studies, and we were kind of talking about, okay, so what are the kind of, what might be called the methods, and what kind of methods are kind of, fit that sub-discipline. So I'm particularly interested in haptic ethnography. So it has its origins in visual and sensory ethnography from Sarah Pink, he used to be here at RMIT, I think he's at Monash now. So just a few of these methods, just sort of going through and explaining them. They're really about how to gather or tap into tacit behaviours and perceptual habits that people may not necessarily speak about, remembering, Margaret Mead's famous quote about what people say they do and what they do are two entirely different things. So this is kind of like following that. So video reenactment, so this is a method developed by Sarah, involves asking participants to reenact media use. So you sort of follow them along, take video, and ask them to reflect on their habitual activity as they're doing it. Technology or media walkthroughs, which often involves us, for example, it's kind of like, I've referred to it elsewhere as a bit of a handbag method almost, like you kind of ask people to kind of empty out their phones in a sense. Like the old way we used to get people to empty out their bag and you could figure out all this stuff about them because of all the little bits and pieces. So the phone is kind of like similar in a way, asking people to give us a walkthrough of their phone. The Think Aloud protocol, that's used in HCI and is very useful here as well. It sort of follows cognitive processes. So basically asking participants to say whatever comes to mind as they're doing something, and that's particularly useful in terms of understanding their use of mobile games. So we use that one quite a bit as well. Online media diaries. So this is where it uses a bit of visual ethnography, asking participants to take photos, sort of like it could be a day in the life activity, and asking them to describe their daily media use and upload relevant photographs and video to a blog, for example. And then we revisit these diaries and ask participants to sort of talk us through it and explain. And haptic experimentation. So this was a kind of an interesting approach developed by one of my candidates that I shared with Annette, Jess Hardley, who in her PhD thesis talked about, and I've got a reference a little bit further on to her thesis that you can have a look at. Will the slides be available? They probably will be, yeah. You can have a look at. So she had developed a whole series of sort of haptic experiments. So the questions that we're asking is how routines of bodily movement and interaction are modified by mobile media practices, how it affects our experience of immediacy, of proximity, of distance and togetherness in public and domestic spaces. So I've just got a couple of examples here that I wanted to show you. So this is an example of and I noticed, Annette, you're giving a workshop soon on the composite narrative or the fabrication method, which is kind of a little bit what this is as well. So I won't read it out, but, you know, just have a kind of a quick read through. So this is sort of like an example of the way that we would tell the story or provide the narrative, a kind of a sensory vignette. This is one that actually a shortened version of one that Rowan and I used in the Bodies and Mobile Media book, which is Quality Press, which is coming out in another month or so. And basically you can kind of see it's a sort of a narrative, a sort of a crafted narrative. For the purposes of the book, we didn't include any theory in here, but obviously you can. And, you know, if you look at, say, Jess's thesis and other work that we've done together and work I've written separately, you can see how it's possible to kind of weave the sort of theoretical approach into that kind of narrative. So here we talk about her, you know, the fact that she's listening to sounds, she's walking, you know, it's a pedestrian experience, using hands, you know, for flicking and gesture, you know, the gestural interface, etc. And then talk about how there's a real intimacy to these practices and a personal connection to this device. So this is just kind of one of the ways in which we could use ethnography through these kinds of, I guess, sort of narratives or sort of composite accounts of participants' experiences. And then just quickly, this one here. So this is, again, comprises part of Jess's thesis, and we also collaboratively published a couple of articles on this as well. This research was actually prompted, I've got like 4 minutes still, is that okay? Yeah. So this research was actually prompted by the rape and murder of Melbourne stand-up comedian Eurydice Dixon as she was heading home after a gig. Some of you might remember that occurred in Melbourne, I think in 2018. And she texted minutes before she was home to her boyfriend saying, "I'm almost home safe," a few minutes before midnight. The thing that was interesting for Jess and I in this was the fact that the senior police officer, David Clayton, at the time urged people, women in particular, you'd assume, to take responsibility for their own safety, to have situational awareness, and to always carry your mobile phone but not be on the phone at night. So these very specific instructions, right? Now, if you're a woman, this advice is a little bit like mansplaining. Women are already and always acutely aware of their situatedness and immediate surroundings, particularly at night. I would argue, particularly in the city and particularly in certain places of the city. And women use their mobile phones in a range of strategic ways to deal with risk. So this notion of perceptual vigilance describes this kind of hyper-awareness that women experience in urban spaces at night, and the ways that it's literally felt in the body, that kind of sense of anxiety and potential fear. So we used a kind of combination of phenomenology, corporeal feminism, haptic and digital ethnography in this research, with many of the methods that we just listed there. And the research basically revealed that women's use of mobile phones in urban darkness it has this real paradoxical tension. On the one hand, as you can see from these quotes, on the one hand, women viewed their mobile phones as having reassuring affordances. So, you know, as if they kind of incorporated this always-on connectivity of their phone as, you know, into their body schema. In a sense, it was like an as-if form of safety. You know, it's kind of like not a real sense of safety, because obviously people that are distant from you, you're connected to your friends and family, they may know where you are. You may actually be talking to them through social media or a chat or texting, for example. So there's this kind of as-if sense of safety where we perceive ourselves safer simply because friends and family are aware of our location. We might be in connection, in contact with them. Yet women also clearly understand that in actuality, mobile phones offer no real protection in the face of immediate and present danger. So in a sense, I guess, while mobile media may reconfigure our relation to actual and virtual spaces, in the darkness, in urban darkness, and, you know, in the cities, we, you know, for women, we kind of return to this brute actuality of the potential of threat. So connection to others provides comforting and familiar feelings of ambient presence or co-presence, even while we're simultaneously aware of the inadequacies of online communication in situations of bodily reach. And it's this incongruity that we called the safety paradox, and it's a contradiction that sits very uneasily in the body, and suggests that we need to think carefully before offering the kind of advice that implies mobile phones offer any real kind of protection for women at night. And that's it. I just wanted to finally finish up just with one final slide on multi-species ethnography, because this is where I'm going now in a lot of my work. It's a fun story about where the data takes you. Larissa and I were working on a mobile games 3-year discovery that involved going into 60 people's homes, and there were lots of animals everywhere, all the pets, every time. Pets were always the first to greet us. They intervened in the research, etc. And we were kind of, started off by saying, oh, you know, get them out of the way. And then we kind of thought, well, actually, hang on a minute, they're part of the data. And so then we kind of started to turn to sort of thinking about, you know, what are the digital lives of companion animals? And we've got a book coming out with Duke University Press next year on companion animals and digital media. Yep, so I'll finish there and hand over to, is it Kelsey? Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Ingrid. That was extremely rich. I'll be thinking about some of the things that you shared for a while. How's everyone doing? Okay, yeah. Who here has done any form of ethnography or digital ethnography before? A fair few. Okay, great. And then other people are here to learn. I actually really like methods, so I'm going to power through this in 10 minutes or so. I have a bit on methods and then a bit on an application of those. And so I guess what I was trying to do in this presentation was, in thinking about digital ethnography, I actually wanted to talk about hardware and kind of ground the digital in the physical and show how it's interconnected. So Annette has wonderfully introduced digital and ethnography to us. But to recap, I guess, a little bit of my own interpretation. So it's a qualitative research method. And the way I'm talking about digital ethnography today is really ethnography in digital contexts. And what is a digital context? Well, as Ingrid has alluded to, it's everything. You know, we're always in a digital context in today's world because our phone is in our pocket, we're being recorded, you know, we're working online or studying online with colleagues and in relationship and so on in digitally mediated and grounded ways. And so we want to look at the everyday and people's everyday experiences, and also kind of human and non-human actors, to use Latour's framing, and not just analyze people and culture, but also try to explain it. So drawing on frames of interpretation to explain those everyday cultural experiences. So some very, very high-level ethnographic principles. I love this idea of the ethnographer as the instrument. I do a lot of work with engineers, so blending mixed methods, blending qualitative and quantitative research methods, but coming back to, yeah, this very kind of embodied sort of sensory data gathering, very subjective kind of method in the world. And because we're going to subjectively interpret the world and then, you know, write peer-reviewed publications and books and all these interpretations of it, one thing is that declaration of positionality. So actually reflecting on and articulating your own position in relation to the research field that you're in. I think that's always more entangled and more complicated than you can present. For example, my research field for my PhD is decentralized technologies, for example, blockchain and other peer-to-peer protocols and so on. I worked in that field prior to doing research, and then after my data collection kind of continued to work in it some more. And so there's always an entanglement there. And then reflexivity, which is the ability to provide an account of your influence on the research and your experience of it. And I think the simplest way I can put this, which I actually learned from a methods workshop that you ran, Annette, when I was a first-year student, is like, get a piece of paper, write down the data, something someone said, something you observed, something you experienced, do a column, write your reflection next to it, walk away, come back, do another column, write your reflection again, and keep, iterating on that process, around whatever theme it is that you're studying until you kind of start to surface patterns and interpolate insights and so on. So data collection, analysis, and then lots of stars next to communication of results. I really want to emphasize the importance of writing. I think a lot of students feel like they might not be an expert yet or have something to contribute. For some reason, I wasn't graced with that anointing, and that's actually really, really helped me through my PhD process, and now moving on to my postdoc, was just to write. It really helps you to analyze and transform. It gives you a purpose. You're not just reading things, but you're writing a literature review, for example, and then you get published and you kind of realize at some point, oh, maybe I do know something about this or have something to contribute. And then last of all, digital ethnography is a tool in the toolkit. I think it's really helpful to speak about phenomenology and kind of where this method fits amidst other contributions. So it's not a silver bullet, but I think understanding what you do bring, and also, especially in technical contexts, like I mentioned, understanding that I am able to look at, social dynamics in very kind of tech-heavy domains, or to contribute a feedback loop, not just on the design of a technology, but the actual delivery and use and experience and affordances and limitations of that has been some of the things that I've done in my research. So resilience, or to talk about the application of these methods, was the framing of my PhD. Upon reflection, I don't know if I would choose that again. I definitely don't have any regrets. I've loved my PhD experience, but it took a while to frame up and kind of firm up exactly what that meant and what I was looking for. And then I've mentioned some of those things about methods. So really sort of focusing on the context and interactions. I was looking for, adaptability and transformability. And I looked at related concepts like threats and vulnerabilities in what people said, but also in, the actions that they took, the motivation, the types of systems that they wanted to design against, what kind of, real or imagined contexts. And in identifying embedded values through that. And so some key assumptions when I engaged in this digital ethnography of resilience in decentralized technologies, that systems are social and technical. I really like constructivism. I really like science and technology studies. So there's some flags if people want to go explore. I grounded my research in the theoretical lens of infrastructure studies, and that was actually wonderful because that really translated to some of my key research informants in the contexts and fields in which I worked. Like people understood, like engineers understood this idea of infrastructure and could connect with that. And then infrastructures as co-constitutive, so the social informs the technical and vice versa, and actually an infrastructure is both of these dynamics unfolding together and constantly changing. And so that links us to more application in one of the specific use cases that I studied, or case studies, on hardware, specifically microchips. So I looked at the metaverse and crypto states and all these very kind of cutting edge concepts and emerging technologies. But I actually found for this particular case study, it came back to very tangible things, hardware, microchips, supply chains, and so on. And so Kongland was my field, and what they're doing is these little things called halos, physical NFTs. If anyone's into crypto stuff, it doesn't matter if you're not. They also had these notes, so they tried to make cryptocurrency, which is digital cash essentially, physical again, and the way that they made that unique was using kind of cryptographically verifiable microchips that were embedded in these physical notes. I should have brought one today, but I didn't. And so, we talked about that experiential lens of this method. I joined Discord, which is just an online chat platform. That's where this kind of distributed crypto state gathered. And I ended up becoming elected as a senator in this state due to my involvement. I'd done a little bit of writing about it and gotten to know the co-founders and so forth. So here I am suddenly kind of helping make decisions about the strategic direction of this crypto state, or, you know, trying to help them think about their strategy and reflect on, you know, some of the challenges of, you know, how does a decentralized group of people manage, you know, a supply chain, which is a very kind of tangible, real world thing. And so that was a very fun and dynamic experience. And again, access is this really key component of any ethnography, especially digital ethnography. And so kind of gaining access in such a concrete way was a real advantage to my data collection and insights. Just some of the quotes. You know, all these grand concepts, but at the end of the day, some of our monthly meetings were like, how many sausages do we need for the sausage sizzle when we all get together? So on and off ramps, again, the digital had very physical implications. So thinking about, you know, value in this crypto state and these verifiable microchips and so on, but you know, how do you cash in and cash out of that through these real world kind of points of exchange? And then some of the insights and findings. So really this case study kind of hangs on this idea of materiality, or the actual physicality of, you know, cryptocurrency and cyberspace and the metaverse. There's some quotes on there that I won't read out to you about materiality as a kind of conceptual lens. Really around these kind of artifacts and arrangements and practices. Again, and then this idea about reconfiguration. So that's where the resilience comes in. So the adaptations that have to occur, not only through the kind of governance of this thing, but also through the physical artifacts. And so some of the high-level insights and findings that came out of this case study and my PhD research as a whole was this idea of self-infrastructuring. So through looking at how people engage and why people engage with decentralized infrastructures, I found that at the core, this whole practice is really about doing infrastructure yourself. So the ability to design, own, participate, govern, and maintain infrastructure. And that's really informed by a political rationality, like comes out of kind of libertarian origins. And in crypto ideology at the moment, we kind of see this conjoining of right and left politics in a weird kind of circular way, where everyone thinks that this sort of is the embodiment of their beliefs, but it's about, you know, co-ownership or individual ownership of infrastructure. The physical stuff specifically came down to this idea of full stack self-infrastructuring. So it's not just the digital kind of cyberspace domains of sort of the early internet where people want to self-infrastructure, but it comes all the way down to the hardware. And to self-infrastructure and have this kind of cryptographic independence and kind of co-ownership collaboration, it has to include the physical elements of these systems. And then lots of opportunity, which you can read in my forthcoming PhD once it's published, for, again, both qualitative and quantitative methods to continue to explore some of these areas. So if you're interested in those ideas coming out of the research, there's one thing I've published in Big Data and Society you can take a look at. So that's all from me for the moment. Really happy to chat to people afterwards, and I hope that helps ground digital ethnographic methods in kind of physically tangible, understandable things. Thank you.
Hi, how's it going? It's great to see such a great turnout on such a drippy day. Has it been a good symposium so far? Were you all here this morning? Well, I mean earlier in the afternoon? No. Okay. You know, when I was still teaching high school and classes were that quiet, I'd just be like, start making jokes like, is this an audience or an oil painting? Thank you. Thank you. Is it just that big one? Okay, so I'm going to take you through a project of mine. Oh, why? Why is it doing that? Oh, okay. Didn't do it before. A project of mine that I did some years ago, and it still continues on and off, but this is kind of the biggest section of it, which was around 2016 and 17. These three fabulous women are Tessa, Aseta, and Vanetta. And Vanetta, the one on the right, was my high school student and from year 9 to 12. And I got to know her very well during those years. And then after she graduated, we continued to know each other through a lot of community-based arts projects in the western suburbs. So this project really grew out of that and out of a larger multi-year project I did called Culture Shack, which was about kind of scaling refugee background and new migrant young people, often first in families, through the kind of Cert 1 to 4 system and then up into university entrance, but doing that off campus because a lot of those young people really felt uncomfortable on university campuses. But there's such a rich arts scene and lots of rich arts facilities, particularly in the western suburbs, that I got money to basically do those certificate courses, programs as arts projects in the arts facilities. So this what I'm going to talk about today really grew out of that Culture Shack period. I'm also sort of extending Apodurai's notion of the social imaginary, if you're familiar with that concept, and kind of theoretic, and looking at Samoan digital performativity as a new intercultural imaginary. If I so it shouldn't keep going. Just quick. Okay. Oh no. It's the big button, right? Okay, I'll keep an eye on it. So this quote really was one of the kind of galvanizing reasons that I started to do this project with these young women and their families around their relationship between religion and their use, in particular, of social media through performing arts. And my interest in it was how, at that time, and I think things have kind of progressed quite a bit since then, particularly with platforms like TikTok, et cetera. But at that time, they were really using Facebook videos to in a way that I didn't see other young people using it. And it was really about, so they would post these amazing singing, sometimes goofing, dancing, acting, but a lot of singing. And if you have any Samoan friends, you would know that singing is a really core part of their lives. But they were posting things that were really kind of beautifully performed, beautifully harmonized, and kind of intersectional work between sort of R&B, sort of Samoan traditional songs, which in a sense weren't traditional. They were really interpolated with kind of missionary spirituals kind of stuff. And I thought, first of all, the form was really interesting, but second of all, their mastery at performance was fascinating to me. And so I started to talk to them a lot about it and found out through invitations to an event that they have in their churches every year called White Sunday, which I found really ironic. But White Sunday is every year when the young people take over the service and really perform. And in these families that I know, they, and I think this is a common practice, they they really perform from birth. As soon as they can sort of get up on the stage, they're performing with the youth group. And so they become not only, it's this kind of fun and creative way of instantiating their faith, but it's this incredible kind of, workshop for performance skills. And I guess in the American tradition, we have a lot of performers who come out of the Southern Black Baptist tradition and those church services, and there was certainly an element of that in this that I found really fascinating. But the way that they used the social media to me was kind of this hybrid of it wasn't there to proselytize, and it wasn't there to kind of get on The Voice or something, but they were really, really, really good, and it was to connect with someone, family and cultural diasporic communities, but they also had this level of really appreciating when they had more likes than their sister or their brother or whatever. So there was an individualist kind of performative, not capitalist underpinned, but a kind of performative element to it. But at the same time, they were very clear that the purpose is not about aggrandizing themselves, but about God and the faith. All right, I'll try it again. Here we go. No? Okay, I'll just keep going back. So this quote is really, for me, exemplified it's in this book. This is the long version of the study. So it's in this book called Creativity, Religion, and Youth Cultures. And basically what they're talking about is the role that creativity plays in the church service. But I would argue that it's the role that it plays in their larger lives as well. So the sense that they were trying to convey in the white Sundays services was that everything was acceptable, everything is always collective, and that social media or the visual or the digital is always part of that. And I'm sorry I didn't have any pictures of White Sunday in this presentation, but it's a really grand affair, and everybody's dressed up to the hilt, and it's a pretty cool event. But co-ethnography is an interest of mine, collaborative ethnography. It goes by many names, and I sort of draw on some of the work in this book of a scholar called Mandy Rose, who's at Bristol in the UK, if you're familiar with her work at all. And she has this amazing project called Are You Happy? The Are You Happy Project. And if you Google it, her name and that, you'll find it. But the project itself is based on a French anthropologist filmmaker called Jean Rouch, who was a hero of mine and I used extensively in my earlier work and in my PhD. And he kind of did the original project in the 60s on the streets of Paris. And what they did at that time was walk around with a camera and interview people in an ethnographic manner about whether they're happy, literally, and have them tell stories about that. What Mandy Rose did, and what I tried to do in part in this project, was to kind of democratize, in a way it relates to what you were saying, Kelsey, like to decentralize or democratize the ethnographic process, the research process. And so her project has a website where she basically reintroduced the Rouch project, did some extension of it, and then said to people all over the world, you do your own research. So her essentially the provocation in it was to get the researcher out of the way as much as possible. It's an astounding kind of, it's not so much the product that is incredible, but the implications for it. And even in some of our colleagues work in DERC who look at, like the way in which people self-record and so on. I guess I'm interested in taking that further in looking at how we as ethnographers, as long as we're going to be ethnographers, still curate and mediate those works and those self-produced artifacts, and whether that's culturally or in any other way appropriate anymore. So is ethnography, as I would argue primarily the child of anthropology, is ethnography appropriate at all anymore? And certainly there are many branches of anthropology that address these questions and continue to innovate around these questions. But at the end of the day, I still feel that our work as researchers is has lots of room for examining these difficult questions about how we're representing others and if that's appropriate anymore. Okay, so here they're talking about humor, which they would find this very funny. And talking about humor, one of the things was that I found interesting in their project was, and this came out, and I did some work a couple of years ago with Megan Bowler, who's another person who has written in this area. If you're familiar with her work, she's at University of Toronto. But she had a book, a co-edited book with Matt Ratto called DIY Citizenship, Critical Making in Social Media. And some of those chapters address these questions as well. And also the kind of need, I suppose, address that need, if it is a need, in research practices to create a coherent narrative. And you've heard a little bit about that today. But as long as we're doing some kind of thematic curating, what are the limitations of that for representing full and contradictory lives or experiences for that matter? So the humor aspects to these women's lives, both at church and at home and in school for that matter, the places where I was with them was fascinating to me because they were very clear and consistent across. It wasn't just these three women, by the way, there were more participants, but they were very clear that non-Samoans, they would say it like this, non-Samoans don't understand our humor. It's impossible to understand this humor if you're not Samoan. And I was interested in that, particularly because the rest of their lives are so imbued with this kind of project of, or kind of mandate to share their faith experiences and we're all children of God. You don't have to come over to our form of Christianity, but we really want you to consider this pervasive reality that we're all in this together and that we're driven by a love of God and for God. And so to me, those two, one was sort of like this, kumbaya, inclusive, ethic about life. And the other was, oh, crap. Okay. I'm almost done. And the other was not a rejection or an exclusivity, but I thought a kind of privateness that was specific to their culture, and they were really clear about it. And they would show me lots of videos, particularly some really funny ones called The Laughing Samoans. If you've ever seen those videos on YouTube, they are hilarious, but I don't get them. I mean, they're funny. They seem funny when anyway. So that's some of what I wrote about, was that juxtaposition of, how are they using these videos, performance videos they're making, and they did do both things, and it was intentionally doing both things. One was to speak in ways that only that other Samoans would understand certain kinds of songs, gestures, etc. And in the other way, it was to speak to the kind of the whole world. Okay. Yeah, sort of talked about that. Stop. Okay. Just to finish up. Okay, so I thought the other thing that I was really interested in with the way that they perceived themselves and the work that those videos were doing was this. It was around notions of global mobility and global and locality or stasis. And in cultural studies, there's been a long history of examination and education and outside of globally mobile workforces, et cetera, and elite globally mobile workforces. And so one of the things that they were really articulate about was that they were working class, they didn't have much money. That is the case for lots of Samoans here in Australia, in New Zealand, and back home on the island. But and a big part of their lives is about also tithing, so contributing some of their income to the church. But they were really clear that their creative practices and products was about global mobility. It wasn't for some kind of product to be marketed or sold, and for followers or capital or anything like that. But it was about maintaining diasporic community, and it was about expressing themselves in a way that was, unlike the two laughing Samoans, was completely intelligible to me and others outside of that community, but held additional meaning for folks inside of that community. So how, the idea of how to different kind of innovations and ways of making yourselves globally mobile when you're not physically, I'm still fascinated in and do some work in that now. So I guess just finally sort of looking at these, my home discipline is education. I look at these works as, and the self-circulation of those works as well, as public pedagogical acts through the creative products and practices, and that they present a kind of intercultural interface, both locally and virtually, and so that they're like I was keen not to look at them only as digital or even social media artifacts, but rather as these kind of intersectional landscapes or flows, as Epidurai would call it, that allow the women, all of them in their community, to be able to do creative work that was also doing the intercultural interface work. So I think I'll just leave it there. And you can see more, yeah. Okay. You can see more on the website. I co-directed a lab called Creative Agency, and you'll see more on there. And also, if people are interested in the methods, so there's this book, which is about the Samoan project, and then I have another book called Video as Method, and it talks about Mandy Rose and lots of other examples as well. So you can check that out. Thank you.
So I'll wrap us up with a discussion about how I use various types of visually oriented mapping techniques based on Adele Clark's situational analysis and various forms of concept mapping. And when I mention mapping, I guess it's interesting because we're at an Urban Futures Symposium. So when I mention mapping, I guess you might be thinking of maps, like street maps or network maps of public transportation, or maps of CCTV cameras, or even layers of the city in GIS mapping. And those are very relevant in how I think about mapping. But today more I'm focusing on the kind of I'm focusing on concept mapping. And I don't know why the slide's not there. Maybe it's in somewhere else in the lineup of slides. So what I'm going to talk, so here I'm talking about a particular tool of situation and context mapping within a larger bucket of techniques I might use depending on the situation. So this is one way that I cut in on a particular phenomenon. And I think concept mapping is the better way to think about it rather than these maps, because, and I'm just going to see if maybe they're somewhere in here. They're not. So I had these visuals of some concept maps that help to illustrate that what I'm trying to get at is not the outcomes of mapping, which is what you see here, but the process of mapping, which is what's underneath these maps. What happens when people do mapping as a verb, as an action? what they're doing is they're looking at things that are maybe a central node. So if you think of concept or mind mapping now, you think of central nodes or a focus of your attention, maybe a building if you're looking at a city map, or you might be thinking about your destination. And what mapping does is it either points you to where you are going and finds you a route or a pathway, or it's helping you orient where you are, so it's situating you and positioning you, or it's helping you understand that various nodes in situations are connected. And they are, and these connections and relations are what's actually part of the mapping. So when I do mapping, I'm trying to find movement or motion along lines between nodes that are are points of connection, not points of connection, but connecting, right? So I'm looking at connecting. And if you think about, well, if I think about some of the premises behind this approach, and it aligns very well with some of the other things that have been said here already today, I would take for granted from a science and technology studies perspective that anything we understand to be reality or a context or a situation or a field or a phenomenon that we're studying is a socio-technical system. And that's a complicated word or phrase because it's quite entangled, and it means that any kind of material or social entity is a product of multiple overlapping and entangled structures and practices and technologies. And in that, there's this kind of understanding of entanglement. So I take a sensibility that everything is entangled, including me, in this process that creates something that we take then to be concrete reality. And then those entanglements are not just local, but they're global, and they're implicated by multiple entities like users and platforms and platform owners and device types and settings and algorithms and data analytic systems, and lots of global and as well as local infrastructures and structures. Well, and AI, since we have to mention AI these days. Within that, then, there's a lot of agency. There are things that act with a gentle force, which is a phrase that I kind of prefer rather than agency per se. But we talk about human and non-human agency to understand that any single moment of lived experience in the digital era is going to be implicated by multiple forces, whether those are human or environmental, whether they are by creatures, more than human creatures, or technologies that function with agency or have force in the setting to influence it. The question that I've been grappling with for maybe 20 years now is, how do you get to that complexity? How do you even start to unravel that, presuming that there's a point to unraveling it in the first place, right? And for me, context mapping is one of the tools that I use, because it helps me lay out layers and layers of situational factors that might be relevant, that I might need to pay attention to. So what I'm trying to do when I'm mapping is I'm trying to engage in a process of generating a lot of layers and layers of data and more information and stories and more possibilities. So I might take a field note and then explode it out into a lot of different maps of a tiny micro moment to build the complexity. And it is quite generative in that it just adds more and more and more data that one can analyze. In doing so, I can't help but move and understand that I am a living body moving through these environments. And not only that, I am the portal through which the phenomenon passes. I'm, as an ethnographer, and as Kelsey mentioned, the instrument through which the data is interpreted. So there's So how do I get myself into this phenomenon to acknowledge and to understand how my own movements and my own choices about when to study, what to study, who to focus on, how to pay attention, are making the boundary that we later call the field. So I'm very obsessed with that kind of focus and the reflexivity that's required to have integrity in those kinds of situations of sense-making about complex situations. In doing that, then I'm also interrogating not just what I see, but also myself. Most of this method is intended to get me beyond my own self and my initial interpretations of whatever it is I think I know. So I have this process of mapping, which I think in this case mapping can do many things, but in this case I'm focusing on how it generates. It generates research questions. It generates different strategies for how I might sort materials. It generates lots of analytical possibilities and directions because it opens up and explodes out a single moment into 85 or 90 maps. It helps me generate more entities that are involved in the situation and thereby more relationships between entities. And then it also helps me identify some of the links between the local and the global. And then I think most importantly for me, it helps me identify what might be missing. And I guarantee you, if you do 3 or 4 situational maps over the course of many years of teaching this, you will find things that you didn't realize were impacting the situation that you maybe should have been paying attention to. And you'll be shocked and you'll be like, well, how could that possibly work? It does. So you can see me mapping here, and what I do is I basically start with a word in the middle of a page, and then I expand out. And in this case, what I'm trying to do is just put a person, a place, or a thing, a noun, or a verb, or a short phrase in the middle of a page. And then that guides an open brainstorming. So this is basic spidergram or word mind mapping, that kind of thing. So let's say I'm working on a project about how algorithms influence people's everyday lives, and I'm focusing on a streaming platform like Netflix because it annoys my sister endlessly that she can never find anything to watch on Netflix. And then she says, I can't even control what I see on Netflix. It never shows me what I want. And also I can't find anything to watch. Right? I sympathize with this.
Switch to another streaming platform.
And all of them would be the same. So what I generally start with is trying to think about, well, what's influencing that situation, right? That's a very broad question. But so I start with what are all the human and non-human agents that are influencing the Netflix algorithm? And I always put a question at the top of a map, always. I also put a number on the map, although you don't see one there today in that one. And then I just use words in circles and I connect that with other words that I put around the edges, and then I connect them with lines and circle some things, and then keep going, and then I brainstorm all the things it's making me think about, and then I'm making lines and random connections and using serendipity as a way of making sense of this. And then I try not to think too much about it, and then after about 10 minutes I stop, because otherwise I could just keep going on forever. And then the next thing I do is I start a new map. I take any word from the original map. Usually I pick something on the periphery that might have been tangential, because I'm trying to use space as naturally as possible. So I pick a random word from the first map and I put it in the center of a new map, and then I create a new question. And then I start the process again. In this case, I might be asking, how do I feel about that? And maybe that's not a great question, but you use whatever question works. And over time, you get good at this. And you start to, answer the question. annoyed, suspicious, mistrustful. So I'm brainstorming out, and I'm testing out both different kinds of questions, and I'm trying to see if any of those elements on the first map that I did might play out in a second map or maybe in a third map. So I go back to the first map, and I might pick another one, and then I start a third map. This is not a paper-saving exercise. And each new map opens up all these new directions and possibilities, and following these pathways may generate entirely different sets of ideas about the topic. And it starts to get really messy, because what ends up happening is that you open up what feels like a really tiny unit of cultural information. It's just a moment. It's called the algorithm, the recommendation algorithm on Netflix. And it opens up all, and that's really not a great example, but you get the point, that it explodes out into a million pieces, or what feels like a million pieces, because I'm telling you, 85 maps later, I might be thinking about a completely different topic than what I started with. And I end up with stacks of maps, a room full of maps. And at one point, one of the words on the map is around sexism. So on map 89, I'm talking about sexism, which seems a really far point from where I started. And that's the point. Because what this does is it generates all kinds of new ideas about where you might go, what you might do, and then you can start to narrow the process afterwards. All right. So that's the basic idea of mapping. And I have done this in a lot of different classrooms. I do it all the time when I'm teaching methods, and I encourage my own PhD students to do it, but I also do it a lot myself. Here, I'm just going to show you this kind of layering effect. This is a Danish example of a person who's done a little map, but what they did is they put transparency paper over the top of their map, and then they started to write on the transparency paper. So they created a map here, and then they have a transparent layer, and they're mapping on top of the transparency layer. In this case, the person did it with little sticky notes, which is way further than I would go, but has great value for them. This is in our most recent study of SPOT in the public sphere, the Boston Dynamics robot. This is an example of using Miro board and physical mapping to develop a complex kind of a system of connecting ideas. So here you have a physical map, and then you have a transparency layer laid over the top, which somebody did more mapping on top of. Then they took a photograph of that, and they dropped it into the software application Miro board, and then they started drawing pink lines around to connect ideas. Then they were dropping images in. You could kind of see where this could go. So there's a lot of interesting applications for how you can create layers. And I'll just close by saying that the whole idea of mapping can have quite generative effects by in different ways, and we've done it, and I've done a few experiments here. The one on the left is using allegorical or Victorian era emotion mapping to do affective mapping of one's relationship with platforms. And this is thanks to Dan Harris and Stacey Holman-Jones, who brought that method to me in 2020. And then we took that to Italy with my PhD student, Riccardo Pranzato, who did it with his students to map out their emotional affective relationship with their platforms vis-a-vis using terrain. The center is using the idea of transparency layers to think about how one might imagine different cities by creating different, in this case, physical, well, kind of localized terrain maps. You can imagine doing this also with context maps, where you're using transparency layers to build connections in a different way than you can with circles and lines. And in the third example, which I did in 4 different cities last year, we did a lot of thinking about what would happen if you tried to combine concept mapping with mood boarding and thinking about cities as affective environments. What could you get if you combine those 3 things together and talked about mapping the moods of the city? So I'll close it there. Then we have, I think, some time for some questions and answers. Questions. Maybe fewer answers than more questions, but if anybody has a question, we'd be delighted to discuss. Hello. I even have a microphone. And if you don't have a question, we could ask you a question.
Well, we could ask each other questions.
We could ask each other questions.
I have a question for you. Oh, sorry. Mike, I had a question, Annette.
Yes.
I think it's on. I had a question, Annette, about, because I know that you've done work with the internet, you know, the metaphor kind of side of things, about the notion of the map as itself a metaphor. In other words, when you're working with people and asking them to do mapping, I was sort of interested to think about what preconceptions they have about what maps do. In terms of, you know, they're organisers, right, in some way, or kind of, you know, they kind of often articulate other kinds of metaphors, like, you know, conduits and things like that. Just sort of thinking about that, is that something that you've, yeah, and also whether there's a kind of a cultural difference there, which I think there probably is in terms of the ways that we kind of culturally perceive mapping and maps.
No, it's a good question, and the first thing is that maps is just one. Mapping isn't a word that I use, you know, like repeatedly in a talk like I did just here. So it's one of many tools we might use. And when you pair mapping with concept mapping or mind mapping, it tends to open up a different kind of sensibility. But I also think that when I started this project of doing concept analysis or situational analysis, I was using network sensibilities as a metaphor to think about nodes and connection and movement. So I was trying to use the metaphors to open up new ways of thinking. So mapping instead of maps helps it be less static. And so wayfinding would be a better term if you were going to think, if I was going to use it in that way. I'm not trying to get people to map. I'm trying to get them to brainstorm. In this case.
Well, even brainstorming.
Yeah, okay.
You know what I mean? Like that, it's kind of like ways of organising or ways of kind of perceiving that in and of itself is kind of interesting. I was just thinking about the ways that people actually perceive of something like brainstorming.
I think it's actually really important, Ingrid, and I think I've been spending a lot of time in my career trying to find different vocabularies for what it is that we actually do as researchers, specifically to jar us loose from the preconceived ways we have of doing things, only to disrupt the habitual, right? So, I mean, my whole concept of remix or remixing methods was an effort to do that. So there's lots of different ways we can, I think less important than the metaphors or the vocabularies and how they constrain us is to recognize them as metaphors and then find new ones to get to a different sensibility. Not necessarily the right sensibility, because there isn't one only right way, but to find a different way.
I just wanted to very quickly say, because it's related, it's kind of sparking off some, I'm just working with some German colleagues on a edited collection on container technologies, right? Part of that is talking about conceptually what containers mean to us. And, you know, in a lot of work, like McCoff and Johnson's work, they actually identify container metaphors as one of our originary metaphors. In other words, it's one of the group of ontological metaphors that we use in everyday life, along with things like conduits to, you know, for transmission, etc. But containers is one of them. So maps are kind of like a form, you know, like there's a sort of a sense in which conceptual maps, they form a kind of like a conceptual container. In the same way that we might think of our mind as a container, you know, as the mind as a container. So I'm just sort of thinking about that idea about what the, because in the book we talk a lot about, you know, properties of porosity and leakage and filtering, and how they are kind of like forms of resistance against containment in its discrete sense. Yeah, I was just kind of riffing off that idea.
See, there it is. There it is. Now we got a question in the back.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation to all the participants. I guess my question is in general, but it's very connected to Dan's work, because I'm a PhD student here at RMIT in Global Studies Center. And I'm reflecting about Latin American migration experiences and how the Latin American are using this digital space and this whole information communication technologies. And it made me think a lot when you mentioned this, how they curate images or discourses, the curation of these images and discourses. And I connected to how Latin Americans, they curate the content they share back home, they send back home, and they collectively create these images and discourses to tell about what is the experience to be in Australia, to migrate to this country, which is very far from home. So it's kind of interesting how through the digitality, how they are creating, how they are making sense of their own experience. And, you know, in this time where like digital and physical are very entangled, it's a mess. Like we live it at the same time, we can't separate it. But it seems like digital, in the digital, there is another discourse. Well, what is the experience of migrating to Australia in practical terms of finding a job, house? It's different. So it's kind of different discourses. Anyway, so it's just more like a general comment. If you can say something about that. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. Yeah, thanks for that. It is super interesting, right? And I think that there's interesting work starting to be done around also like I know some migrants having separate Facebook profiles or Instagram profiles for, you know, that you can share with family at home versus their real life here and what they're really doing, kinds of things, and that's super interesting as well. But I mean, I guess some of what I find interesting in what you're sharing is around, like we've heard today, as well as there's so much work around the intimacy of, you know, of our devices with us, but at the same time, how do they create distance? And how do they, you know, I mean, in a sense, yes, I would agree, who could not agree that we're entangled with our digital representations, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that they're authentic or comprehensive. So, I mean, I would be interested in work around that, more work around that. I haven't done any on that, but I guess the project with the youth from the Samoan community got into some of that because it was about curation, self-curation. And so I guess as researchers, I'm interested in how we can assist people doing this work in their own community and keep, like, yes, our bodies are the ethnographer's tools, but they don't have to be. Ethnography can be something else, right? Like a self-practice or decentralizing the power anyway out of us sitting here in a university room that has lots of funding that isn't necessarily going to those communities. And the other thing, I guess, is just about not everyone has access, right, to digital tools or platforms. And I think it's important to always keep bringing that reality back as well, as that reinforces, as this accelerating entanglement reinforces a particular kind of widening gap. So, who can afford to migrate really far from home? Is it people who can afford to send happy pictures back and say, yes, it's all worth it? Yeah. And again, global flows, right? Yeah. Thank you for the comment.
Curation has become such a political, and partly because we are in a participatory media environment, we all curate. We're all aggregators, we're all curators. And I think that's why your work is so interesting, Dan, because you're actually kind of saying that we share that activity with our participants, and that the act of curating is something that should be collaborative. I think, yeah, important.
So hi everyone, my name is Tarun. I am a PhD student at CAR, and I have a very basic question for Professor Markham. So, So I have a very basic question. So while we are doing this sort of mind mapping, how do we actually analyze those maps? If in case we are producing like 80 maps, so how do you analyze those maps? And a follow-up question would be, how do you decide on the boundary of these maps? Like, how do you decide that this would be your field of study? Yeah, these are the two questions.
I have a couple of simple questions for you.
Yeah, those are simple enough. Yeah. Those are great questions. In terms of how do you analyze the maps, it's important to understand that any data that you collect in a field is going to be partial, non-representative, but also complete and very representative. It's the act of doing ethnography is not an act of doing a survey, for example. The methodology of ethnography is more, as Kelsey said, subjective, interpretive. And so the analysis of the maps is not as important as the generation of the maps. So they may become data that you can analyze and even code if you're using a social science method of coding later. You might be able to analyze them and find common patterns and themes, but you should recognize those are your own themes that you're generating, right? So then you can connect that back to whatever you were doing before you started to do this mapping as an exercise. Mostly it's meant to be generative and produce additional questions that you can ask, or they might point you to salience that's different from what you thought it was. So what might be relevant in a situation might become more apparent after you do the maps. So it's more of an exploration rather than a set of precise data points that you might analyze. So it's more a practice of doing it. And about finding boundaries of a field, that's a really good question that a lot of ethnographers have asked, especially in the digital era where, for example, I would point you to Christine Hines' work, H-I-N-E, on thinking about the boundaries of fields, because they are primarily informational or discursive or based on, how we move through environments. So at some point, fields are, and they're also temporal. When do you decide to stop? And that becomes your field, right? So there are some great, yeah,
like Ingrid's point, the constructions.
yeah, they're constructions. So I think it's important to think about the field as something that you construct, not something that necessarily pre-exists.
Yeah, of course, and this is
Yeah, just to add to that, one helpful thing that my supervisor, like it comes back to those choices, those subjective choices that you make as the researcher. Like I said to one of my supervisors about a case study, like it just keeps going on and on, you know, more happens and you're part of it and you're collecting data. She's like, yep, just make a choice, like find a logical endpoint and wrap up the bit that you're looking at, and one phase ended and a new one started, but that's where I stopped and started my analysis. To the previous point about decentralizing the power in kind of the practice of ethnography itself, my colleagues and I, led by one of my supervisors, Ellie Rennie here at RMIT, have a piece published in Qualitative Inquiry called Towards a Participatory Digital Ethnography of Blockchain Governance. If anyone is interested, we used bots that were plugins to Discord, the chat platform, to actually participate with online communities in data collection. So they used emojis to tag things that they thought would be relevant or they wanted to contribute and flag our attention to in the research project. And now we're currently in the process of shaping a project that is looking at doing GPT integration. So buzzword AI, to do some of the same sort of stuff about actually, yeah, and ethnography actually being participatory, where we're all kind of.
There's a lot of, and I think there's a lot of that going on. I mean, you know, there's creative practice ethnography, there's, you know, it's got lots of different titles. This kind of shift to you know, positioning the participant as an expert. You know, they have expertise in their own lives, which is what you're exploring, right? So this is kind of, I guess, that recognition. But it has a lot of, it's used, you know, design, anthropology, there's a lot of different fields, I think now, and also fields that focus even on children and how to position children as experts as well. So lots of areas to explore, and I'd imagine that in your own fields, you would be able to find, you know, methods, papers around participatory methods. You know.
But Bates, we probably have to end, but the ethics of that are very interesting.
yeah, so
thank you. Let's give a round of applause to the panelists again.